She'll be doing the questions today, Jody. It's all yours.
Okay. Well, we'll start where we've started with most other people, which is introduction to the labyrinth itself. As I understand it, you attended Jean Houston's Mystery School, or was it before that time?
I attended Jean Houston's Mystery School for a full year in 1985, and it was the second school that she had done. And then in 1991, by that time I had moved from New York City to San Francisco. In 91, I had 1 month sabbatical, and I was really kind of fried. I was really burnt out with a lot of the work we were doing at the cathedral, with the whole AIDS epidemic moving into what it really was, a pandemic. And so I needed time off because I was thinking of leaving Grace Cathedral. And that's a great Labyrinth question. What's my next step? What's my next step? So I was asking that. And I also knew I was looking for something. And I didn't, you know, how intuition works and you're kind of underground with it and trying to figure it all out. And then now, 20 years later or 25 years later, you can step back and say, oh yeah, that was what was going on. So I went and took just one weekend, I believe in late February, whenever the first one was, the mystery school, called Jean and said, hey Jean, you know, wow, I have a little bit of time and I'd love to come dip back into the mystery school. So I called Jean and said, hey, I have some time and I'd love to dip back into the mystery school. And she said, sure, come ahead. Jean's always generous and thoughtful. And so that was the time that they introduced the Labyrinth. Now, I think they worked with the Labyrinth before, but that was when I connected to it. And I oddly always kind of knew something about a labyrinth. I didn't know much. I knew it was in Chartres. I knew somehow that much, I think. But, and then they taped a, 11th Circuit medieval labyrinth, yes, not with the center and all the lunations and all of that, but really just taped it on a floor of the conference center, and walking it was really, obviously a life-changing experience.
What happened?
Well, first of all, Jean used it ritually, and I don't often speak of this because I think people don't understand it. But so we were front to back. We were all kind of moving into the center. Jean was in the center. And you were to take a question to her. And that's what I mean by people maybe not understanding that, but it was a ritual and Jean, really teaches ritual. I learned so much from her around just how to do ritual for large groups. But later it cleared, the labyrinth cleared, and then I walked it, and that was the time it really kind of, I embodied it, came inside, got imprinted in me, and I think that's such an important piece of the work we're all doing. And then I say in Walking a Sacred Path in my book that I had this really significant dream about having, I'm forgetting, let's see the dream right now, but it was about your life. It signaled my life was going to change. Really did, signal that. And so from that time on, it wasn't so much that I wanted, again, to leave the cathedral. It was like, okay, how do I reinvent myself? And I was just in the perfect position. But it took a while for the idea to come in. I mean, I was really walking the labyrinth in that early time, taped on the floor, set off a lot of restlessness in me. That kind of hound to heaven feeling, something's hunting you down. And so it took a while. I think it was probably end of March, maybe April, that I'm literally walking around my living room, literally, and saying, what is it? What is it? What is it? I remember yelling, what is it? And then put the labyrinth in the cathedral. And then my next thought was, well, who could do that? And then I realized, oh yeah, I do have a cathedral handy. And so it just all fit. And I think that's one of the things that when I look back at my life, realizing during this period of time, everything was sort of organized, everything was planned. Somehow I was just kind of following the gifts that were coming toward me. For instance, I never applied for the job of canon pastor at Grace Cathedral. I never even put an application in. Plum job in the Episcopal Church, and it was handed to me literally by the new dean, Alan Jones, who I was teaching with in New York City at that time, in the Center for Spiritual Direction there at General Theological Seminary. He said, I want you to come on out and be a canon pastor.
And that's why you moved to San Francisco.
Yeah, that's why I moved here, 1986. And and then when I arrived at the cathedral, just because of people I knew in New York, I got a very large grant, $285,000, to set up a center for spirituality. So I called it Quest, Grace Cathedral Center for Spirituality. And boom. So all the programming we did, all of that, then the Labyrinth just perfectly fit in. So I even had the container to begin to work with the Labyrinth. It all
meant to be.
All flowed. Yeah.
That's perfect. You mentioned in your book and just now the importance of ritual in what you do and what you learned from Jean Houston. If you could describe just very basically, why is ritual important? What does it do?
Yes, a ritual brings you into the moment. It brings you into the present moment. So you're honoring the moment. I often talk when I'm teaching and training facilitators is that there's what's called the old smooth stone method of ritual. And the old smooth stone ritual is what we get in our churches. You know, the Grace Cathedral, the bells ring at 11 o'clock, the choir starts singing, there's a beautiful procession, then you do the collect, and everything is lined out. And the old smooth stone method, I'm using that from Diana Eck, who's a theologian. The old smooth stone method really then allows people to let go and just trust that they're in a container, that something is going to bring them to something of meaning. Well, the way we're using ritual is much more what I would call new paradigm ritual. You know, in the old smooth stone, a baby cries, you ignore it. In Labyrinth ritual, a baby cries, and you say, we stand here hearing the new cries of new life. Something, or an ambulance goes by and everybody's kind of straining in the old smooth stone method to hear. And in ritual, bringing you into the moment, then you acknowledge, you know, someone is in need of help and we're grateful that someone's there to respond. Something. So ritual really does open up the old ancient ones inside of us. And it allows us to be present with all that we are and all that is within us and in our communities. Because ritual really does weave together community.
It sounds like the difference you're making, the distinction is that the old smooth stone method is one that is comfortable. It's comforting. You know what to expect. Everyone is going to behave according to the rules that have somehow come into being and are expected.
Yes.
But in the new ritual methods that you're discussing, it's being in the moment, which can change according to whatever happens.
Yes.
So you need to be present in those moments and aware.
And ritual is bringing people to be present in those moments. And, you know, that's where we want to be, is present with ourselves. We want to experience our experience and need to in order to know who we are.
So then you're creating new and different rituals. As many different times I've been involved with the Labyrinth in many different places and gatherings and so on, there are always different rituals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is the idea of going to the center, there's the idea of community, of joining hands, of singing, you know, those kinds of things, but it all takes different form.
Yes.
So that's essentially what you're talking about. It's not you get there and you expect the bells to ring at a certain time and the choir is going to sing certain songs. And
that's right.
Okay.
See, because the ritual connects, new paradigm ritual, the ritual that we're doing through the labyrinth, with the labyrinth, certainly the wonderful ones that TLS does, the large rituals, it connects the inner with the outer. And it was Hildegard of Bingen who says when the inner and the outer are wedded, that's her word, that's when meaning is produced. And that's what we're doing in New Paradigm Ritual or Labyrinth Rituals. So when you're in a ritual and then you light a candle or you're handed a lit candle or you're invited to burn a piece of paper, you see you're coming into the moment where the inner and the outer, hopefully, are wedded. And that's when we begin to feel our lives have meaning.
Where they become aware of each other, essentially.
Aware?
Mm-hmm.
No, they become married. They become wedded.
Okay.
I mean, not aware, because it's not a thinking process. It's in the very moment, there's meaning. And that is what people are looking for. Mm-hmm. And of course, you can't say that happens every time, but that's what makes ritual meaningful.
How so many things have fallen into place for you in terms of opening up the possibilities for you to introduce the labyrinth. Aside from your workshops with Jean Houston, were there other influences that led you there that made you feel like these were steps along the way?
Yes. After we began to, well, of course, one of the important pieces in here is our time at Chartres Cathedral. Because the cathedral, Grace Cathedral, was looking at a major building campaign. And so I wanted to do more research on the labyrinth. And what that meant was going over, walking it, whatever, but it was much more difficult than just that because it was under chairs, and had not been opened. We guess it hadn't been opened since the French Revolution, but there are times since there were times when BBC did a special and the chairs were cleared in the labyrinth, but otherwise I think I can use past tense. It was an embarrassment to Chartres Cathedral officials because we really have lost the mindset that would have even brought an 11th Circuit labyrinth into the floor of the cathedral. It really is another world. And so that time, and we can talk about that later, but that time helped us at the cathedral. There were 6 of us, and we went and we moved the chairs and we got yelled at, and I always joke that my first word I learned in French was police because it's the same. And after that, and we really confirmed that, yeah, we want a labyrinth at Grace Cathedral. I didn't know we'd wind up with 2 of them. After that, then whole bunches of folks started coming into my life. Richard Feather Anderson, for sure. Alex Champion, for sure. David Healy, I mentioned in my book, the late David Healy. And we kind of got together, and I remember an evening over when Alex lived in Berkeley, and just had an evening of dinner together and talking labyrinths, and I knew very little at that point. And so that was great. And books, yes, indeed, for sure. And then experiences. I mean, I remember us doing some kind of really weird and wonderful pagan ritual. I'm sure we were tossing salt over our shoulders and bird seed in Grace Cathedral. And we did a cleansing, an energetic cleansing, and the only place that the labyrinth could fit was the only place available. For instance, and so
did you douse it then?
We did douse it, and the dowsing became more of a kind of energetic cleaning, and of letting, moving things over a little bit, allowing some space for the labyrinth, and so it was a really interesting time. There was just lots of people flowing in my life, the right books, the right people, all of that. And then that's when we started creating the canvas labyrinth. And that's when Richard Feather Anderson, I called him and said, I can't do this thing. I'm trying to draw, and this is not my field. Numbers, geometry, And so I'm trying to draw the 6-petal center. And Richard said, oh, and this is controversial in Labyrinth world about the 13-pointed star in the center. But Richard showed me the kind of how you do this. There are certainly other ways of doing it, but that was the way we laid the center in the first canvas Labyrinth. And lots of stuff was unfolding around that time. The 6 people, except for the dean, and Dean Alan Jones was with us in Chartres, but the 5 of us got down on our hands and knees, and that's when we started sewing the canvas and painting the canvas. And thank heavens, one of my friends, Barbara Artress, says, you probably should cut this into 3 pieces. What do you mean 3 pieces? Well, it's going to be too heavy to travel. And I'm thinking, travel? Who's going to travel with a lot? I mean, I was just, but just kind of following what presented and responding in the moment. So we Velcroed it and cut it in 3 pieces, and then I started traveling with it in March of 92 was my first trip out.
When did you go to Chartres and take the chairs off the...
Yeah, August of 91 we went to Chartres Cathedral.
Okay.
And we didn't know that the dean that became our friend, Francois Legault, became our friend. He was not there as dean yet. And so it was sort of rudderless, and we were trying to contact them and get permission to go and move the chairs and walk the labyrinth, and no, there was just no response. So we kind of went and did it anyway. So
it was very bold of you to do that.
It was. Now, in retrospect, it was. I think it's probably the first activist act I've done, clearly and consciously. And I'm glad I did it.
How did you choose the sharp pattern as your? It is, as I understand it, your, if you want to say favorite or the one that has the most power for you?
My heart song is the word I use. Yeah, it really did choose me. Unlike lots of folks, especially in the Labyrinth Society, they're really interested in many different patterns, and I'm not. I have my pattern. That pattern does the work I want to do in this world, and I'm far more interested in the people who walk the labyrinth than the labyrinth. And so finding the 11th Circuit Medieval Labyrinth really, put me on that course of, okay, this is the work I want to do. Drawing people deeply within, using it for introspection, self-awareness, teaching people how to self-reflect, even in this world of reaction instead of response, giving people spaciousness inside to be able to value and reflect on their own lives.
We should probably go on to TLS.
Uh-huh.
So you were doing workshops at this point. The labyrinth, the canvas labyrinth, was cut in 3 pieces. It was portable, and you were taking it around the country. And you went to Connecticut, if I recall, where Helen Curry was enticed by a friend to attend your workshop.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Can you tell me about that?
I still remember Helen walking toward me carrying a whole bunch of flowers because she was asked to bring them for the event. And I just remember her smiling and bringing these wonderful flowers forward. Wow, who's this? This was rather joyous. So, yes, by that time I was traveling. And then when TLS started in 1998, John Ritter and others, Robert Frey, have always said, that because, we started Veritas in 96. And let me say a little bit about that because that goes into the background of TLS. Here we were, I was at Grace Cathedral. In a way, I wanted to make sure that the labyrinth was understood in a way that people could receive it. And here we're in a large, open-minded, open-hearted Christian community, but still, those early days were very tender days because it could easily be misunderstood. And, it still is. The labyrinth is misunderstood. Symbol of the devil and all this stuff that people are projecting outward because they're frightened of inward. And so they've often said, Robert and John, that TLS got started because, kind of not opposed to the work I was doing, but to augment it. I was in the cathedral and I couldn't bring in a lot of volunteers. I couldn't bring in, it had to be more focused. And it is, and I think that's one of the wonderful differences between the organizations. But I could really see the value of starting TLS, and so I was the keynote speaker for the first 3 years, just to really begin to draw people and get, hopefully, and begin to get a focus for TLS. So the early times, where were we? Albuquerque. I remember walking with Robert Ferre and saying, hey, this is what I need. I need some canvases made, and I need a tour guide, because I can do both of those.
You were in New Mexico, and I'm trying to remember the name of the place, and I can't. I have a video of it, though.
Do you?
Which I can put you in touch with.
Uh-huh.
And it had the geodesic dome, is that
The
right?
geodesic dome, we had to stand in the center in order to be heard
it's
without echo.
It's a little rough because it's somebody with a video camera doing this, but yes, it's you and Robert, and Jean Lutz was the organizer of it.
Mm-hmm.
She had prior to that time done the Labyrinth letters, and I think attended a number of dowsing conferences.
Yeah.
And so she was, I'm guessing, pulling from that population to get people to come to the first conference at that time in New Mexico.
Yeah, and she was doing a newsletter, something like that.
Yeah, the Labyrinth letter.
Yeah, Labyrinth.
Snail mail.
Yeah, and so that was sort of the early beginnings of it.
Well, and Robert said that at that point you and he got talking about how you needed somebody to do tours at Chartres and make canvas labyrinths, and he did both and talk about changing your life.
Yeah, that's right. Talk about changing your life. Yeah, he said I could do both. I do tours, and great. See, so when did my life change? It really changed, dramatically, and my work at the cathedral changed dramatically. I went on part-time. No, not at 92. I was full-time. But I became canon for special ministries. And that was the beauty of the cathedral, was that it was healthy enough that I could reinvent myself without a lot of conflict and in my roles there. And
what does special ministries?
It's a totally made-up title. We didn't know what to call it. You didn't see the Labyrinth became my ministry, so what do you call it? Well, maybe Labyrinth Ministry, but, special ministries, because there could be other ministries under that. Mm-hmm. Now there's, 3 or 4 canon for special ministries in the United States. Chuckle, it really is funny. But we just did that title, so.
You were the first. So then the difference between Veriditas and TLS, at least at the inception, you said because of the constraints or the construct of the church and the funding sources and the structure of the church itself and how it was organized and so on, you had certain parameters within which you had to operate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whereas TLS, according to Helen, her point of view was, there it is, do whatever you want with it.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, I agree with it, but Veriditas is really, and partly because of our founding at the cathedral, it's very focused on spiritual uses. And of course that includes creativity and healing and bereavement, and so that whole huge area of spirituality. But we weren't in the place where we could just say, go do what you want. We couldn't do that. And I don't know that I would want to, because we started hearing, and that's partly why I started the training in 97, is that lots of people were coming and saying, well, I heard this is the work of the devil, or I hear this symbol is, people are doing weird things in it. And so I felt like the whole movement could go awry and hit a dead end by not educating, explaining, teaching, having people experience it directly, because that's the key, is is have people have a direct experience of the labyrinth.
So in terms of the facilitator training, was there discussion at the beginning of TLS as to whether or not they were going to do training as well? Was that something that, how did you determine Veritas goes that direction and TLS did not?
Well, it wasn't so much determined. I mean, I don't feel I determined it. We started this training in '97, partly in response as well to the rector of Chartres Cathedral, who wanted to make sure that people understood what the labyrinth was. So we had some political kind of concerns there too. He was he was very open-minded, but he was also felt that a labyrinth should not be present without an altar. That's really limiting.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to do kind of both. And we began the training in '97, partly because of all of these kind of misunderstandings of what the labyrinth was. And then when TLS started in '98, it was great because they are still committed to education and experiencing the labyrinth. And an annual conference, which I think is just great. And Veritas we didn't want to do that. That's not our model, and so I think it worked out well, but I don't feel like that I had a lot of say in that.
So then you also shared the Worldwide Labyrinth Locator.
Yes,
And I have some idea about how all of that started, but I'd like your point of view.
There's a great story on
Yes.
that. So here I am. I'm over in Glastonbury, right? And we're at Sig Lanigan's. And there's several TLS folks. I think Robert was there, and I'm not quite sure who else. There were 8 TLS people, I think, or 6 maybe, and me, and here I am, Veritas kind of thing. And the atmosphere, we were in Sig's lovely home, and the atmosphere was really strange. I mean, people were really, I don't know, on pins and needles or whatever. And so, but what happened was, and I think I was vaguely aware of it, but TLS's database had been hacked. Somehow all the references of where labyrinths were and that was lost. And Veritas had a database. I don't know whether it was, further along or lesser along, I'm not sure. But then we all sat down in this real tense, and they asked, would you consider having one database, sharing the data? It's a no-brainer. Sure, of course. And everybody's shoulders kind of went down, and I mean, it was really funny. This one question, and oh my God, what happens if I don't know, but it was really a loaded meeting. But got dispelled really quickly by that's a great idea.
Well, it seems as though, I mean, if you're both beginning your pathways in different, sort of different but parallel directions, how do you define yourselves without being in competition?
Absolutely.
And still profit, still flourish.
Absolutely. And it was tense times. It really was, because we were trying to feel our way, and TLS was feeling their way. The word cooperation is, I think, a good one. That we cooperate a lot. We probably were in more competition than now. I mean, because now the organizations know who they are, and that helps a lot.
So you mentioned that people were initially, some people were concerned that this was the work of the devil, or Toby mentioned, if it had something to do with astrology or New Agey stuff. What specifically comes to mind? What experience comes to mind, or question that someone had along those lines, and how do you dispel their fear about it? If, as you say, it comes from a fear of going in.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is education. And that's why it's important to tell people this is a contemporary labyrinth. I've been working with this, experimenting with the design, so people have knowledge of, oh, okay, this is a contemporary labyrinth. Okay, this one comes from the floor of Chartres Cathedral. Oh, this lovely seven circuit classical labyrinth. It comes, with long, as you well know, historical roots. That's one level. But the other level, I don't ever feel we're going to have fundamentalists really embrace the labyrinth. Because if you can't think metaphorically, if you can't, and then again, that's what I mean by self-reflection. If people can't reflect because they're scared to do that, and there's a huge brand of Christianity telling people, don't look inside. That's where the devil is. You see, and that's probably why I was getting that message much more than folks who don't darken the door of a church. And so to me, feeling like, wow, this could go off the rails really quickly. This could really go off the rails. And Veritas had started in 96. So by 97, it was like, okay, we've got to do something to address this. But, how do you help someone, go inside? I mean, the labyrinth is a great tool for that.
Well, now you, prior to your becoming a priest, you were a psychotherapist?
Yeah, and still am.
Jungian by persuasion, or?
Jungian oriented, I would say. So in other words, I've had certainly Jungian work personally, but I'm not a Jungian trained therapist.
How do those two professions, I mean, on some level it's obvious, how do those two professions dovetail for you and your work?
The integration of psyche and spirit, and just simply that, the psychological, the spiritual, and the labyrinth brings those together beautifully. And I feel that that's why I'm on the planet, not only to introduce the labyrinth, but to knit together the psyche and spirit, which, we're divided only because of our languages and our misunderstandings and our fragmented understanding of what life is.
Do you see, you mentioned in your book, you talk about the divine feminine and recognizing the feminine aspects of the labyrinth and how evocative that is. Do you feel that now the divine feminine is re-emerging, for example, the Me Too movement, or?
I think it's definitely continuing to emerge. It's changed shape, which movements do, and which the feminine does. And the divine feminine is a shape-shifting element of our world. But you can see how more and more, and the Me Too movement, I think, is a very good example of that. That, it is the end of patriarchy. It's going to be a long ending, but it's getting there. I have a funny story around that. I don't know if it's pertinent, but it is. Let me just share it, and you can cut it out later if you want to. But so here we are. We're doing a conference at Grace Cathedral with CIIS, the California Institute for Integral Studies, and I think it was even before the Labyrinth days of the Labyrinth. I'm quite sure of that. I'm not sure. But here we are. We have Zoo Lakey. I don't know if you know Zoo Lakey, but she's a exotic dancer, and she's costumed, and she has big bells on her feet. Not many chimes. Big strips of these chimes, dancing down the center of Grace Cathedral, and this concert, in this whole conference going on, and leaps like a bird up on the altar rails, and she's dancing along. And the dean is there with a very dear friend, the president of CIIS, Robert McDermott. He's a good friend of mine, and he elbows Alan. He says, "Alan, it's all over." and I was sitting there, I roared. I was really roared. But it is, and what we see now. I mean, just think, Bill Cosby was just sentenced to 30 years. And here in the 80s, he's the father of American culture, especially Black culture, which makes it sad. I think very sad. But it's all changing, and the Labyrinth is bringing that in a way that it's not affrontive to people. I often made the joke about you can bring the feminine into the church, just don't say it. In the name of the Mother, Father, God, I would say that. And then someone said, "You said what? Didn't you say Mother, God?" "No, I didn't. I said Mother, Father, God." It could easily be misunderstood. But the beauty of the Labyrinth is that it's evocative. You're working with your direct experience, and it's flow, not force. It's cooperation, not competition. It's all of those things that we can't illustrate very much in our culture because we're so achievement oriented.
So this is you're comparing this end of patriarchy with what I heard you say a number of times in different ways, moving beyond Cartesian ways of thinking.
Yeah. And see, the Labyrinth was created pre-Cartesian.
By a long time.
A long time, and especially the classical, but here the Chartres Labyrinth, and that's what has changed in Western culture, is consciousness has changed, and when Descartes walked the world stage, then all of a sudden we're thought, think, therefore I am. And this earlier template that supported intuition, supported non-logical thinking, supported, just a whole nother world got lost. And I think that's really very important. And it comes back to some folks, and I don't know, TLS or Veritas, that doesn't matter, but some people think, that you're going to find in another new labyrinth that's going to be created that will be more effective than the Chartres Labyrinth. And this is maybe the early days, but I think it's an important point that, and my response to that is, you don't understand what archetypal pattern means. That maybe there will be effective labyrinths, that's fine, but the Chartres Labyrinth really has those roots of pre-Cartesian world, and that's the world we need to begin to understand more and more as patriarchy dissolves.
You did talk about how it brings imagination out of exile.
Yeah.
That it makes it okay, again, to allow yourself to do that. And I wonder, in terms of encouraging nonlinear thinking, for example, this program that we're creating, where you can bounce from a website back to the video you were watching to a text somewhere else, and it doesn't have to start on page 1 and go to page 50 and end.
That's right.
It can go anywhere. So there is that sense of being able to hold a number of different ideas and things and possibilities in your brain at the same time, and they don't compete with each other.
Yeah.
For space or belief.
They inform each other. They don't kill each other off. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
See, and we need that kind of thinking. We need that kind of creative, imaginative. Really, and I'm actually writing on this now. It's about imaginative perception. How do we understand beauty and God and creativity, and how do we understand the inner workings of our being without being able to embrace the imagination?
So if you have an experience that I might misunderstand or disagree with or think is just absolute lunacy, I can't tell you you're wrong.
Right.
It's your experience. So how do you come to a conclusion of truth in comparing all of those imaginative, fantastical ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. What's the difference between a mystical experience and a superstitious experience? To try to summarize that, that's where, and again, the Labyrinth is really helpful. If you have a body, if you're embodied, the imagination is much more grounded. So it's not wild. In the Middle Ages, that's where it was really, the imagination was manipulated and used by the church. You know, you're going to roast in hell, and hell, sin, damnation, all of that. So the imagination then also conjured up only fear, you know, and people imagine, you know, I'm using my book, the washer woman carrying the laundry to the river, which could easily be the Lura River in Chartres, because stop. That's because let's see, I lost my thought there just a moment.
The woman carrying the wash to the
Yeah, because the woman carrying the wash to the river, then she's carrying the cross of Jesus, and you know, the imagination really became rampant and out of control. But in the labyrinth, when you're embodied and you're moving, you know, the imagination is a flow and a stream of your own kind of nonlinear thinking. But that's again where we need to help people understand that self-reflection is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, even if you have a bad thought. And this is where we're really, you know, we're probably, our culture is in, I don't know, 4th grade around these kind of interior world kinds of thoughts.
So this is connected, but maybe a little bit of an aside. I've heard consistently, one way and another, that people who had experience with Labyrinth indicate that there is an interactivity between what their experience is and what the Labyrinth's experience is, and how they impact one another.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you saying, you know, that it is evocative, that it allows for imagination.
Uh-huh.
How do you see that interactivity happening?
Yeah, I wouldn't have used that word, but I understand what people are saying, because you're up against a template, so it's a given pattern, but the given pattern has a great deal of wisdom to it, and again, archetypal resonance with psyche meeting spirit. So in light of that, you know, when you are on a turn in your life, lots of times you really hate turns, in the 28 turns of 180 degrees in the Chartres Labyrinth. So in a way, the template becomes a reflective mirror for where we are. And I think that would be describing that interaction. So you're meeting something that's other, and yet you're meeting something that's you. Is that?
Yeah.
Does that explain it? I think another way people put it, I know Jill Jeffreyon and I had this conversation about, some people feel that the labyrinth is an entity. It has an organic life, and organic life, what more do you say, unfolding as you are unfolding in the labyrinth as well. And I understand that. I don't talk about that much, because that gets really kind of into the woo-woo area when you're thinking about a tight-minded church. But it happens, and I can see that it is an entity. And maybe we're talking about Holy Spirit, another way of talking about spirit.
There have been comments about the labyrinth emerging into consciousness, into our lives, and becoming manifest, not in and of itself, but that we are becoming increasingly aware of it and creating more of them, because there is a need for that.
Yes, labyrinths order chaos. And in light of that, I mean, in our chaotic time, and I agree with Jeff said, we're done this about, you know, people are looking for a sure path in uncertain times. And the more chaotic we get, the more instinctually we go toward templates and patterns and things that guide us. not all patterns guide us, but the labyrinth certainly does. Whether it's the classical or the Chart labyrinth, archetypal labyrinths, the whole burst of contemporary labyrinths people currently experiencing. And I remember in the early days with Alex Champion, we went to Lake Merritt to see one of his labyrinths that he made, and he was explaining, he said, sometimes people get sick to their stomach in a labyrinth, just because the power of the template, and that wouldn't be a fun template if you're always getting sick, but or feeling nausea, but that different templates produce different things.
Well, you describe the energy of the labyrinth as you see it, a spiral with a vortex at the center. But you say walking it discharges energy, but others describe it as energizing. Is that a paradox that can be resolved?
No, I don't know that that's quite what I'm. When you're walking the Chart labyrinth, you're walking clockwise in a complex spiral pattern to center. And some of the research that's been done on meditation is that if you have a stabilized center and you're walking spirally into the center, that's what helps the mind quiet. Now there's a training issue that we encourage people to, if you're doing an opening ritual, you want to move in a clockwise way. If you're closing a labyrinth, like the Chart labyrinth, is this huge energy field, and if you're closing it to move in a counterclockwise way, that kind of, puts the cap back on the genie jar. Does that clarify that a bit?
Yes, so you're seeing it as opening energy in a way and then recontaining it?
Yeah, and that's a facilitator task, but yes.
Okay. Well, I could go on and on. Do you have things you do? Okay. Okay, we should probably give you time for the rest of your day. One of the issues that we have discussed at TLS is how do we increase our diversity? We're basically an older white group of people, and Reginald Adams and his direction with Spirit Quest is a whole new frontier that we're very excited to be a part of. How do you see the possibility of introducing the labyrinth to other communities, other ethnic groups, other age groups? I know Montessori is very big on labyrinths, and I'm starting with young children, but personally I had the experience of suggesting that to a rabbi that we have a group discussion about when social issues. This was when there was yet another armed slaying somewhere, I think San Bernardino, and to just talk about anti-Muslim feelings and anti-Semitism and so on, and include a labyrinth walk. May have been my fault that I didn't explain myself very well, but she really took exception to that and felt that we were trying to replace ancient traditions that she regarded as sacred with a new one. No, not at all.
Yeah,
but it's a very touchy issue.
Yes.
How do you in your practice see, because I know you did talk about diversity and increasing diversity, how do you see that how do you see a way forward through that?
Mainly through our training. We have trained some Jewish rabbis, that's redundant, some rabbis, and working very actively in active Jewish communities. Very familiar with the labyrinth, very much wanting to teach and join others to teach it. We have our scholarship program that helps. We give trainings to people if they can represent another community of color or a deaf community or whatever. So I think, at least under Veritas, we reach out that way. It's a challenge. There's no doubt about it. It's a challenge. Partly, I think part of the reason the Labyrinth movement, and was named by the New York Times in 1998, May 12th, Sunday paper. And it is because, you know, we've had the time, we've had the financial resources, we've had the ability to kind of travel, to go to these conferences, get movement with the Labyrinth. But sharing it is really important, and I agree with TLS about that diversity. But for Veritas, we're trying to do it through scholarship program, training people in their communities.
Okay. I think that's most of what I need to know. I mean, I could go on forever, but
I
you
always
have
like,
to edit this.
yeah, I always like to ask the question, is there anything we didn't ask? Is there anything
Yeah.
you want to get on tape? You want to
Yeah.
add to this discourse, this conversation?
I think that one of the things that's important, and I don't know whether I was very clear about it, about archetypal labyrinths, you know, that a misunderstanding that continues is the power of archetypal labyrinths, and maybe a contemporary labyrinth can, you know, be equally as powerful, but that they're not opposed, and one's not better than the other. And I think it's dangerous to look for a better labyrinth rather than a labyrinth that brings yet another experience toward opening the ability to look within and self-reflect and find the alignment within ourselves and the world to co-create, to bring new form into being.
Just to be clear, when you're talking about archetypal labyrinths, are you talking about Chartres and the Cretan or the Minoan labyrinth, the ancient patterns
Yes.
as opposed to new patterns?
Yes, I'm talking about ancient patterns. Yeah, and the contemporary patterns. You know, I think they're great, but even Herman Kern in his book says, you know, the archetypal pattern brings this in, and the artist who is free to explore their own probings, creative probings, sometimes fly in the face of the archetypal labyrinths. I'm not quoting it very well. I can get you that quote, but yeah, and see, we want to not confuse our public. This is a related issue. We don't want to confuse our public by having a contemporary labyrinth and someone says this is the labyrinth, meaning the classical or the Chartres. It's not. It's a contemporary labyrinth that was made, you know, da-da-da-da, and there's always history. Like the good example is the Reconciliation Labyrinth with Claire Wilson. That's a very viable, lovely labyrinth. It also fits very well into, you know, Cape Town and South African tradition more than it does here. I would call that a specialty labyrinth here. And the workshops I do, you know, have the Chartres labyrinth, and then you walk the Reconciliation labyrinth. And I usually have people role play, usually people who are not reconciled, and do a role play, and then bring that experience back into the Chartres labyrinth. But
in a way to what? To sort of get that much deeper, or like you said, put the lid on the genie jar?
Yeah, well, no, to integrate the experience. So I might say to people, so a workshop we had one time, 18 people, we paired people up around issues, and somebody had a real conflict with a sister, and another person had a conflict with a sister. So we put them in a role play situation. The one person described the sister's always scowling at me, she's always criticizing me, and then as they walk the Reconciliation Labyrinth, this person's scowling at the person, you know, and to bring forward the feelings of how do I reconcile this and what is going on here. And then they reversed roles, and the other person did the other sister who was always, you know, and had that experience, and then they shared verbally, and then brought it back to the Chartres Labyrinth. And it integrated it deeper. It brought it into another way, of the psyche being able to kind of absorb the experience.
It's finished.
Yeah.
Took the rough edges off.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of explaining it. Took the rough edges off.
Okay. Is there anything else we've missed? I mean, I'm sure there are endless numbers of things, but that you feel is important, particularly in terms of TLS and Veritas, the differences or the similarities. Where are you headed from here with Veritas? Now you've moved your offices from the IONS campus to Petaluma, and you're kind of backing away from the intensity of your dedication initially. You have numbers of trainees who've gone through the facilitator process. How do you see Veritas moving into the future?
Well, we're training trainers now, so there's more people doing a facilitator training under the auspices of Veritas. And so that's a step forward. And so to ensure that Veritas is training people, and also, we have kind of two prongs to our work, that we train people, and now we're training people to train people, but also to offer significant spiritual experiences at sacred sites, Shard, Iona, different places around the world. And so training people is really important, and that feels right. So as I move away, as I back off, I'm doing some trainings here. I'll train at Grace Cathedral, and I enjoy occasionally going to Australia, different places. So it's always train in Shard. But for me, I see the Labyrinth is just continuing to work in my life. I'm writing now, and on a slight hiatus because I have proposals out in the world and to secure a publisher. So I'm kind of like, don't change the book now. And so I'm trying to I don't know, in my own personal life, bring the depth back in different ways. It's interesting here at Rossmore, we have a Labyrinth. The Trail Club put it in, which is great.
It was not your idea.
No. It was here before I came here. It's definitely an apple that rolled from the tree of Grace Cathedral, but people often don't know where the apple came from. But it's really a lovely labyrinth. And so I've been doing, I did a solstice ritual on December 21st this past year, and we're thinking about a summer. I know I'm speaking on the 21st, but whether I'm going to do a ritual or not for June of the summer solstice. But it's interesting and kind of nice to see it just kind of permeate the culture. Just see it as it is, and it's really been a gift to see what people have done with it.
It's wonderful to just stumble on them.
Isn't that wonderful?
I just did when I was in New York. We were going to the Frick Gallery and walked by St. James.
Yes.
And there was no one there. The organist was practicing. It was lovely. We had a private concert. And on our way out, there was a side sort of vestibule with a small 11 circuit.
Interesting.
Very geometric. It wasn't a shop.
In the floor or in canvas?
In the floor, yeah. Too small to walk, but it was there. And, that was just wonderful. And then the one at my granddaughter's school.
Yeah.
So just to encapsulate or wrap up, what's the officially, I suppose, or even unofficially, the mission statement, the focus of Veritas, and how has that remained consistent? How do you see it remaining consistent in the future?
And the board now, and I'm attending some of the board meetings or parts of the board meetings, because that work I'm just delighted to let fade out of my life. but really about transformation. I mean, using the labyrinth as a metaphor, using it as a way of building community, as a tool of self-reflection, and to help transform the consciousness on the planet. And no small task, but labyrinths do that, as we know. And so just to encourage all of that, and use the labyrinth, and teach people about it, and give them a valuable and solid, good, especially first labyrinth walking experience. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The backing, truck backing up. So if you could ask that part of that
Is
question.
it an
again.
ambulance? Is it or?
Construction
It's a-
vehicle backing up, I think.
Yeah, it's
Oh. No.
Maybe we're gonna back up and put the dog in the truck and then drive away.
the, we can only hope.
Yeah. Yeah.